Welcome back to Where the Ramp Ends. I'm Bryce,
And I'm Summer.
and today we have Ricki Sabia from the National Down Syndrome Congress. Welcome to Where the Ramp Ends. We are so excited to have you on the show today.
And I am very excited to be here.
Would you politely introduce yourself to our viewers who may not be familiar with your work or the National Down Syndrome Congress?
Well, the National Down Syndrome Congress is a national organization that represents people with Down syndrome first and foremost, their families, their allies, providers, all of the above. We have a lot of different services we provide. One of the things we do is a lot of policy and advocacy work. That is the area that I am in. And I have been doing this work for, oh my goodness, nationally for 26 years, and started, and we'll talk some about my early advocacy. My son, Steve, who has Down syndrome, is 34 years old. So I've been around the block for a while. And in my career, I've done a lot of volunteering in advocacy. I went into the national policy realm. I've worked on federal education policy, mostly K-12 policy. For all those years, I work with the Department of Education. I work with Congress and so helping advocate for what the regulations and the statutory language should be that affect our students. Um, let's see. So I also have worked for federal projects. So the federal government pays money, grants to certain organizations to provide what's called technical assistance to states on how best to do their work. So I've done that for the National Center and State Collaborative, which developed an alternate assessment years ago, as well as curricula core content standards, but broken down into core content connectors and all kinds of information to help teachers teach the content to students with significant cognitive disabilities. I also worked with the TIE Center on inclusive policies and practices for students with significant cognitive disabilities. So, because a lot of students with Down syndrome end up rightly or wrongly in the alternate assessment, I have focused a lot on making sure that those students get a very high quality education, regardless of what state assessment they take. A senior education policy advisor, I guess I should say, for the National Down Syndrome Congress. And I have wonderful people I work with: Heather Sachs, Stephanie Smith-Lee, Jawanda Mast, Micah Rothkopf.
Yeah, you guys have an amazing group at the National Down Syndrome Congress. I was able to take the advocacy boot camp and attend the convention 2 years ago. And it was just an amazing experience, just packed full of information. I just really recommend parents that have children with Down syndrome to try to attend that convention at least once in their lifetime. It's just such an amazing
And
experience.
we always have that advocacy boot camp. And we always have a lot of parents who have never been before, to learn how to advocate. And we'll talk a little bit in this podcast, I think, about the wide range of what that means. We also have the National Down Syndrome Advocacy Coalition under the auspices of NDSC. And anybody can join this. It's free. You just fill out an application and you get access to a website that's closed to NDAC members and quarterly webinars and other information to help you advocate and also connect with other people in your state who may be advocating on issues and ask questions. And so it's very beneficial and it's free.
It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. I can't say that enough. And the team is Jawanda and Stephanie. All of you are just it's a dream team.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it. We like each other too.
So, Ricki, take us back to what made you want to start this journey with advocacy You say that your son is 34 and has Down syndrome. What was the moment in the beginning of his life where you were like, I want to not only be a strong parental figure in his life, but I also want to be along the advocacy journey with him?
Well, the very, very first moment, although nothing came of it right then, was when he was a baby and we were at the beach and my brother was with us. And he saw me watching an adult woman with Down syndrome who seemed to really be struggling, and seeing my face, looking at my little infant. And he said to me, tomorrow, Steve, on the treadmill, like that, because she was very heavy and it was really, encumbering her. And so, that it was a joke, but to me, that made a statement that Steve's future is not set in stone. There are things we can do as a parent, and later I realized as an advocate, that can change that trajectory. That, yes, he has this what's called trisomy 21, but he is also a sum total of his life experiences, his family, his schooling, so much more that goes into it. And that it really made me realize that I had to look at, what path I thought was best for him until he was able to help advocate for himself, and then try to get us there. And then a little later on, I realized that the things I thought he needed were not just a problem in terms of me being able to advocate for them. It was a systemic problem. There were things that were just not being put in place, even though maybe the law said they should be. So then I realized, well, if I want to move things for Steve, and also, I realized that there were other families who are not in a position to advocate for their child, be it they work through jobs, be it that English wasn't their first language, be it whatever reason, that I was in a privileged position to be able to try to help others while I helped Steve. It was never not about Steve. It was, about Steve, but it was also about going beyond Steve, like you're doing in your experiences. And so then I started getting more involved. I got involved being a volunteer on a lot of parent committees in my school district where, I could provide a parent voice. But, selfishly, I also got to know a lot of the people who were within the district who, when I ran into problems with Steve, they were good people to know, not with Steve, but with the system interacting with Steve. They were good people to know to help me move along. And through that, I eventually landed on a committee co-chairing it with Madeline Will, who is amazing. If you don't know her, she has a 54-year-old son with Down syndrome, and she was assistant secretary in the Reagan years of education, and just amazing visionary who we have to thank for a lot of what we have. And she was a co-chair of this committee as well. And she was also working on the national level. And that's when she invited me to come and work on the national level in about, I think it was 2000. So that got me to the national advocacy portion of what I do.
Wow. Like what an amazing experience. Just play a part in that. Just to
And
be
believe me, when I started the national advocacy, most of what I knew was what I knew from my son,
yes.
from trying to get IDEA implemented in a way that it was supposed to be for him.
Sure, sure.
So I wasn't by any means, I mean, I spoke at my school board meetings and did some things, but I really wasn't this high level advocate. So it was pretty daunting.
But what a testament, and what I mean, hearing that gives me encouragement, and I know that will give other parents too encouragement that no matter how small your you know your advocacy feels like, it makes a difference.
And I think it's important for parents to realize, and I realized this too early on, that, well, first of all, we're all advocates. We've been advocates for ourselves since we're young, right? We've had to speak up for things that were important, whatever career path, whatever we did. But once our child who has Down syndrome is here from the day they're born. Literally. I mean, my son was premature. They wanted to tube feed him. I'm advocating, no, I want to be able to feed him, and you're advocating from the moment they are born, whether it's with medical professional, insurance providers, infant and toddler program, whatever it may be, even in little ways. You may be even advocating within your family for support you need, or all of this is advocacy. It's all advocacy. And it just is about looking at the goal, the future goal, as well as where you are right now, and trying to figure out what you need to get there. And if you have the bandwidth, while you're doing that, can you also change some policies so that the next parent doesn't have to reinvent the wheel, that you just did for your child.
Yeah, I love that. Because it's not just about making our child's life better, it's also about the ones coming behind us,
Or alongside us. I mean, one of
alongside
the
us.
things Madeline said to me very early on, and I've always remembered this, is first you say, why me? Because you're like, why do I have a child with a disability? Other people, because you're feeling overwhelmed, right? And then you say, why my child? Why is my child having this thing that's going to make him or her struggle? And then you realize, well, really, why any child? So if I can do things to help support my child to reach his or her full potential and raise expectations and get the policies not to be in the way, um, why shouldn't I do this so that every child can benefit, and not regardless of the situation they're in? I mean, I've run into parents. I remember my mother was in the hospital and there was a nurse, and she saw me with Steve working on reading, and she was floored. Like, she didn't know they should be teaching her son to read, because sometimes they will say, well, they're not reading because they have Down syndrome. Well, no, they're not reading because you're not teaching them to read.
Right. Yes.
But it's hard because not every parent knows it, and there are a lot of parents also who come from countries where you don't question authority. It's dangerous. And so there are a lot of people who really are just not in that position for whatever reason. So I'm hoping that every little bit, even at the school level, for the kids that might attend that school after my son, or alongside my son, for each step, for district, for state, for whatever it may be, for federal, that whatever work we do at whatever level will hopefully benefit other people now and later.
You want to go into a little bit more about what you're doing currently for the Down Syndrome Congress?
Sure. So right now, one of our primary things always is to try to make sure we have a strong federal education department that can do the monitoring and the technical assistance that states need to help them implement the federal laws. And I don't know that all parents understand that every little thing, like your child's speech therapy, like your child's physical therapy, like any support they may get in a classroom, this all comes primarily through federal law that many states have now put this into their codes of regulations or their state statutes. But it's from federal law originally, because back when I went to school, because I'm ancient, but prior to the 70s, there was no educational right for students with disabilities. Yeah, I never saw anybody with Down syndrome in my schools. I saw there was one person who was legally blind, but that was it. So when IDEA, which was before Steve was born, quite a bit before Steve was born, came to pass, all of a sudden there was a right to be educated in the regular school. Now, of course, they were, in the basement next to the heating vents and or whatever, and then slowly, and Madeline was a large part of this with the regular education initiative, started moving towards, least restrictive environment, being educated in the regular classroom to the maximum extent appropriate. But even though we have a lot of this in federal law, state implementation, local implementation, because I'm sure there are parents out there going to be saying, yeah, that's not what they're doing in my school. They're still not doing what they should be doing. And so, and people sometimes say, well, why do we need this strong Department of Education if they're not doing it locally? Well, first of all, I can't imagine how much worse it would be without that, because states really need the technical assistance. If they're found, they do letters every year on which states are not meeting IDA requirements, and it's more than half of them. But when that happens, they get technical assistance, they get help to improve things. And even under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, if there are schools where certain subgroups are not meeting the standards under that law, that there's extra money that's given to help those schools improve. So a lot of this funding and what is done with that funding comes from the federal government. And we're in a place right now where we're working hard to make sure that the federal government is not so decimated that it can't do its job. And unfortunately, right now, there are a lot of people who think that we don't need it. And that includes some parents of children
Yeah.
with Down syndrome. But I would argue that we do need it, and that we are advocating as strongly as we can to keep the departments that affect our children in the Department of Education. But they are also general education students first. So we don't want to see the elementary and secondary education department move somewhere else
Right.
and not be with special education. And so we're working on all of that. We're also working, the president's budget recently came out, and we'll be working to advocate, for stronger funding. This budget is very similar to the one that came out last year, where they would block grant a lot of funding to go to states to do with what they want, which has never really worked out well for our kids. So Congress, fortunately, did not take what was in the president's budget last year. They did fund things the way they usually fund them without this block granting. We would hope the same thing would happen for 2027, but of course we have to advocate and make sure that people understand why it is not a good idea to just give money to the states without any guardrails as to how it's used. So there's a lot more to it than that, but
Yeah.
those are two big chunks right now that we're working on. And we work with both sides of the aisle. We have Republican champions, Democrat champions. It's very important, if you're from a red state, to make sure that people understand why this is important. A lot of times people think they're doing the right thing and helping our kids when it's actually not helping our kids, and we need to explain why. And even if you don't live in a red state, if you have friends and family, and I'm not saying that you don't need to talk to Democrats too, you do, because they don't always understand either. So it's very important to make sure that, as Joanne Damask would say, you're telling your story, even if it's just your own story about what's happening with your child. And even if your child is older and can tell their own story or have a written document, to give to help people understand, that goes a long way.
People don't understand how powerful lived experience is unless you're in this space. That's one of the things that Summer and I learned in Partners in Policy Making is lived experience is almost more powerful than a formal degree because you're living that life 24/7. Yes, Steve is 34 years old, but you're you're going to have that lived experience as his mom for the rest of your life. So your story is just as powerful as Steve's because you live it alongside him.
But I will say that Steve can make more of a difference, because
Yes.
I remember I was asked to testify before Congress on what was then No Child Left Behind, which is just a nickname for the Elementary and Secondary Education Act,
Right.
and why it was important, and how it really focused in on kids with disabilities in ways it hadn't before. And so Steve was sitting in the audience and he was reading. He was maybe 7 or 8 years old and writing. Like, he liked to write letters and write, not, the actual letters. He wasn't, I don't know how much he was writing words and sentences, but anyhow. But they were watching him. And somebody said to me, is he an extraordinary child with Down syndrome? Because he was doing that. And of course, this annoyed my husband because, we all think Steve's extraordinary. But I said, no, he is an ordinary child with Down syndrome who has had extraordinary opportunities, because I've been in a position to advocate for
I
those.
love that.
But every child should have the opportunity to reach their potential. And I think him sitting there made more of, and them seeing what he was doing made more of an impact. And even one of the senators has a son with Down syndrome, and we were walking through the halls and Steve was reading the names of the states as we walked down the hall. And he was shocked because his son with Down syndrome was not reading. And I don't know that he was advocating for his son with Down syndrome to get reading instruction. So, all these things make a huge impact. People, I'm sure, Bryce, you've had this experience. People are shocked sometimes when they hear the personal stories, both by what can be achieved, but also by how many barriers are put in the way.
Yes. To kind of briefly talk about that on my personal level, like as a public speaker and a life coach, when I've done trainings all over the state, people are almost shocked when they come into the room and they see me as the instructor. They'll ask me, has the instructor got here yet? And I said, you're looking at it, and they're like, oh, okay. Like, they're almost taken back that somebody with cerebral palsy, or somebody with a disability for that matter, could reach, you know, that level. And I talked about in partners in policy making that, if I was not in a wheelchair with all the certifications and degrees that I have, I would be making well over six figures in an able bodied body. But since I have cerebral palsy, I haven't reached that potential yet. And I said to the world on this podcast several times, why can't somebody with a disability make the living and the career that they want to? And I say this a lot, that society doesn't want people with disabilities to succeed, because then they would have to change their mindset on people with disabilities. Because a lot of people lower the standards for people with disabilities. They don't see us as a functioning member of society.
Well, and I do think that, a lot of society think they want to provide all these opportunities. But
Yes.
when it comes to actually providing them themselves, that's when, and some of it's fear, some of it's
Yes.
ignorance, a lot of, some of it's malfeasance, but a lot of it's some of the other things. And imagine, if you had an intellectual disability, that, people are starting to understand physical disabilities do not limit you intellectually and all the rest. But intellectual disability, it's always, well, why do they need to learn that? They're not going to be
Right.
working, or they're not going to, it's just this assumption that they don't need to learn the same things that everybody else does that's important to anybody else. And when Steve was included in regular classes, and they would say to me, well, why does he need to learn Shakespeare? I'm like, well, why does any student need to learn Shakespeare?
Right.
Someone's deciding what's important. And so if it's important to them, it's important to him. And in fact, to this day, he is in an inclusive theater company because he loved theater and he loved the
That's
plays,
amazing.
and so he probably benefited more than 99% of the other kids in his class, from being exposed to Shakespeare.
I
So
love
you never know. But this whole why someone with a disability would need something, I mean, you don't know that any of them are going to use any of this, but yet you think it's important to give them maximize their opportunities and their choices in life. So, yeah, it's
Yeah.
important for all of them.
So, what do you think has changed the most for students with Down syndrome, but also overall students with disabilities since you've began advocating?
Well, I'm going to go back, I guess, to when I started advocating for Steve. I think he was it. I mean, there was really almost no one with Down syndrome included in regular classes in my school district back then. And I think not that inclusion is anywhere near where it should be, it isn't even slightly close. Many more students are being included, at least in elementary school, with Down syndrome without as much of a fight. Although I still do see on some of the Facebook groups, a lot of parents are fighting the same battles, I was fighting. But I do think that part has improved. And with that, you know, somewhat higher expectations. I do think there is an improvement, but it really depends on where you are. I know, Summer, you've had a good experience. That would not have been possible anywhere where I lived because no one did it back then.
Yeah.
But I also know some people are not having that experience. So it's hard for me to say how much improvement or how much has changed because so much still depends on where you live and what school and the attitudes of the people
Yeah.
you're
I, w-
you're presented with.
I will say when I talk online about how we've had a good experience, I have had people send me messages that either they had a child that went to the same school as Julia or that was in special education or a child that went to the same school and they were in the mainstream observation, as a parent they observed. And I've had several people say, it hasn't always been that good. And I always say, like, I realize that and that makes me appreciate the people that came before us and fought for it
Mhm.
so it is better.
Yes.
I I just and I don't know that I've ever said that. So I do want to say, I know it hasn't always been as good as it is now, and I know that it is as good as it is because of the parents that came before us and advocated.
Unfortunately, it's may not be good still for some
Right.
families, depending on where they live and the
Right.
level of state, the level of accountability that schools are being held to.
Yeah.
I know a lot in our state, the rural areas are where it's suffering the most. The smaller communities, the smaller country towns that don't get the word out as much for disability resources and stuff like that. It's where the bigger cities are seeing the most success. And, that's pretty common, but I'm really trying to advocate for those smaller communities that don't really get talked about, that there's, you know, individuals there with disabilities and challenges that need the resources just as much as the individuals that live in the cities.
We would talk about that a lot when we also talk about vouchers and private school funding. And I know there are a lot of parents who want that for their child, and that's certainly, a good choice. I wouldn't say anything negative about that choice. But the problem when you start using vouchers out of federal funds is that that money ends up coming out of your local budgets, and not everybody benefits from it. Of course, you have to give up your IDA rights if you do that for a child with a disability, But then you add on top of that, what if you don't have much money and the voucher only pays for a part of it and you can't pay the rest? And add on top of that, what if you live in a rural school district where there are no private schools for your child to go to? So the money is taken out of the budget, but the kids who remain, maybe the kids in the rural schools with disabilities, especially ones with cognitive disabilities, where it's hard to get into private schools. So what happens? Who doesn't get choice under
Right.
choice programs is, something that people need to look at and consider.
I'm glad you said that because I try to have this conversation with people about, school vouchers and how it's especially children with disabilities, you know, they argue, well, school vouchers gives parents choice, but it's not everybody gets a choice, especially that because those private schools often don't take children that are on IEP.
Right.
Um, and so it's just taking resources from those kids that are left, just like you said, in the public school system. And so I'm glad you brought that up.
Now, what
That's
people don't realize too is they say, well, but then you're not having to educate them in the public school. But if you have an IEP, when you go to private school, you no longer have an IEP, but you have a right to what's called a not a right, but under the law, there's proportionate amount of funding that needs to be held aside by your school district for students identified with disabilities to provide them with service plans, when they're at private schools for services they may need. And so that funding, if there are, 30% of kids with disabilities that are getting that, but they're not getting the funding for the public school. Yes, they're not maybe being in that classroom to need all those funds, but they're also getting funding to get these service plans. And so that's money that comes out of the budget, even if you're in private school. And then also there are a lot of set costs like building maintenance and, school buses and, capital improvements and so many things that are not individual child that, still have to be paid for, or they'll have closed schools and then you'll have a bus ride really far. And so, there's just a lot of considerations that I don't know that everybody thinks about
yeah,
when this is discussed.
yeah.
And then and that's a very good point because I'm 29 years old and I don't remember when I was in school hearing about, you know, individuals with disabilities being in the private school sector. I'm not saying that there weren't, but we have a lot of private schools around my area, and I don't ever remember hearing anyone with cerebral palsy being, you know, going to any of the private schools around me. I'm not saying they didn't. I just never had personally heard of it.
And sometimes what they do have available are separate schools. Some people think that's good, the thing that's good for their child, and that's fine. But if you're somebody who wants your child to be in a regular class,
Yes,
finding schools that will include them that are private is even
very
more
hard.
difficult. Yeah.
So if a parent has a young child with Down syndrome right now, what's one thing you wish those parents knew about education?
I think it's important, they talk about transition out of school when they're 21 or whatever age. Some states have a higher age. And they talk about transition planning at 16 or 14, depending on, the federal law says 16 or older. Some states have kept 14. But I believe in transition planning from the get-go to think about what your goals are for your child. Now, it may not turn out that that's what your child wants or whatever, but for example, they wanted to put my son on a special ed school bus. And I was thinking, well, one day I want him to have the option of going on the metro and the regular bus to work or to wherever he's going to go. They're not going to just say, everybody step aside and Steve go on the special car of the, he's going to have to. And they also would say, well, we're going to let Steve out of class early so he can walk in the hall when there's not a lot of kids pushing around. I go, he needs to get used to these things if he is going to one day, do X. Now, granted, if some kid has a really big sensory issue and they can't handle the regular school bus, and there's all kinds of considerations, but in
That's good.
Steve's case, there was really no reason for
Right.
him not going on the regular bus other than that it worried them. And so I tried to look at every decision from early on, to try to keep the widest range of options open for him so that, he wouldn't be foreclosed from. I mean, I knew that some things he would be foreclosed from, obviously, but to maximize his options when he was older.
Yeah, I love that. And that kind of goes like we talk a lot about dignity and risk. And
Yes,
so that kind of goes along with that, like give them those opportunities to fail because that's such an important way to learn. They
Yes.
can't succeed if they don't fail. And so,
exactly. And I think, and you need to develop that mindset slowly because let me tell you, when they get to be adults and they go out there and you're not there, um, the idea that, oh my God, something bad could happen
Yes.
is overwhelming.
yes.
But my older son has been very helpful because he would say to me, you're focused on the bad things that could happen if you let him do this. How about the bad things that could happen if you don't give him those opportunities to go walking on his own, to take a bus, to live in an apartment? You know, there are bad things that definitely happen then, and then you're focused on the bad things that could happen.
Yes.
But that's easier said than done. As a parent, you know, believe me, I tracked him on my iPhone when he was on those buses, followed along and did all those things that all us parents do. But it is important to give, and I would tell the teachers, same thing. Look, I'm asking you to have high expectations. I am asking you to make your best effort to help him learn these things. But if he doesn't, I'm not going to be all over you if you've made that effort because I understand, even with my own working with Steve, that there were times I thought he'd be ready to take the next step in something and he just wasn't. But at the end of the day, I want them and I want myself to be able to say, but we tried and we gave him the opportunity and we'll try again later, um, and see if it works. So
What would you say to a parent who feels intimidated walking into an IEP meeting?
first, I would say you're not alone. I mean, with all my experience advocating on all levels and the rest, believe me, I cried at IEP meetings. I was intimidated sitting there when you have, all these people that you feel are maybe advocating more for the school than for your child. And then you're there, advocating for your child. But you are a member of that IEP team. It says so in the federal law. And, the unfortunate thing is that if they don't reach consensus on something, they'll say, well, you can, go to mediation or you can go to due process. And, that's very daunting. But in between that, you have a lot of opportunities to sway the people in that room. And I remember when Steve was in kindergarten, we had him in his neighborhood school, and he was half day in a regular kindergarten, half day in the special ed kindergarten because they didn't have all day kindergarten. And I wanted him to get used to a full day, before he went into first grade. And at the IEP meeting for first grade, that special ed class then went to another school. So they were just assuming they were sending him out to another school to the special ed first grade, as opposed to him going into the general education first grade class, which is what I was thinking. So, I just, told his story. And because at this point he wasn't intelligible at all. I mean, he couldn't really advocate for himself. And, then he had been in 3 schools in 3 years, and that, there are all these students I know who are older than him who are succeeding. And, why can't you just give him a chance? And you don't even know that he can't do it. And one of the other people on the team in OT started crying. And she was like, I don't understand why you're not giving him a chance. Let's see what he can do in first grade. And then before you knew it, like it was a domino effect, no one wanted to be the ones to say, we're not giving this kid at least a chance to try. And so you just don't know what'll be, but you are a member and you get, to say your piece. And hopefully, and you can bring an advocate as well. I mean, I got a little pushback when I was bringing an advocate with me when I knew that there were going to maybe be problems like this. But I said to the teachers, look, don't look at it as adversarial. I am there to advocate for you. If I'm going to want to keep him at that school and have him in first grade, I want to make sure you have the tools, including maybe some staff support, in order to be able to do this. And so look at it as I'm bringing this person in here to advocate with the school system that they give you what you need to educate him.
Yeah. I like that. And that kind of like,
I actually got a thank you letter from one of the teachers for bringing an advocate. Who knew, so.
yeah, I like that approach. And that kind of goes into, I was going to ask you, like, how can parents advocate strongly while still maintaining those positive relationships with teachers? You kind of answered that, but do you have any other advice on that?
I think that you just let them know, like I said, that you have reasonable expectations. They have this image, of this parent that if this child doesn't meet this goal, that's why these IEP goals, are not even really goals. They're practically things they're already doing because they're so afraid they're going to get stomped on, if this goal, which is more forward looking, is not actually met. So, I try to reassure them that if you are trying, if you are making the effort, then I'm going to be your ally. I'm not going to be your enemy. And I am going to partner with you. I am going to work with him at home to support what you're doing in school. I will advocate with the school system to get what you need. I will be your strongest advocate as well as his strongest advocate. Sometimes it was as simple as modeling things. I remember they wanted the kids to draw what America means to them. Well, my son couldn't draw at that age other than scribble. So I got magazines out and we looked through them and he picked out an American flag and we cut it out and we pasted it. And I didn't really say anything to them, but they got the message that, oh, maybe if he can't draw, he can express it in other ways. And this is, maybe all the kids, maybe other kids could benefit from having other means of expressing themselves. It wasn't really to test their drawing abilities. It was to show something about America, So why are we asking them only to draw? Because a lot of the kids have struggles drawing in first grade, So, there are lots of ways to be partners, to model, and you if somebody isn't making the effort, if they're standing in your way, if they're doing things that aren't right, then obviously you need to come forth and be firm about that. But a lot of times it's just they've never done this before. They've never had a child with Down syndrome. I would also say to them, you know how to do this. You may not have had a child who has all my child's issues in one child, but you have dealt with kids with attention issues. You've dealt with kids with speech issues. You have dealt with kids with OT and PT issues. You have dealt with ADD, which he also has. You have you have dealt with a lot of these things, just not in one child. So, pull from your experience. He's no different. He just has a number of things all in one kid.
Yeah.
So, my next question would be, what would be the biggest thing that you have learned from Steve, being his mom and advocating. Also, you can give two sides of the question. What's the biggest thing that you've learned from Steve throughout his life so far?
Well, there's a funny one and then there's a serious one. The funny one is I never thought I'd know as much about WWE as I know. Never in my life, but he has a passion for it, so
As a
I
fellow
learned a lot.
wrestling as a fellow wrestling fan and wrestling collector, I can attest to that. I've been a fan for 25 years, so Steve
So,
and I have
now I know all about John Cena and all the guys, and I never thought I would know anything about that. And but what I've also learned is the dignity of risk, which is very important, and the bigotry of low expectations, and the persistence that he has is phenomenal. When I look at how hard he works to learn things, that it really helps me not give up because he is so persistent in learning things that I have to talk him down sometimes. Look, nobody learns the vocabulary where it's the first day, buddy. Don't get mad at yourself if you can't do it. We would match up cards, the words and the definition. And, I don't expect you to know it in the first time. So, to try to get him to be less hard on himself. But he is the picture of persistence, and it has helped me not give up on things in my own life, having nothing to do with him at all. So,
what do you want not only your legacy to be, but what do you want people to remember about Steve?
well, I want them to remember that he was this little kid who was described as a puddle on the floor, who they told me he would maybe never be verbal, who is now lives in his apartment, has a job in a doctor's office, speech is very intelligible. I can read every text he writes because he's a great speller, loves to read, loves to be in plays. He is far exceeded, took public transportation on his own after he got out of school because they would never let him try when he was in school. Um, and none of that was predictable based on where he started. I mean, he didn't really become intelligible in his speech until he was an adult, in his 18, 19. I mean, I cried big salty tears at my older son's wedding when Steve gave the speech as best man, and other people laughed at the right points. It meant that they knew what he was saying, they understood him. And so, to just have those expectations is so important. So I want that to be Steve's legacy, who people who have met him and have younger kids to see that don't set your expectations from what other people tell you or even from what you see when they are young, because so much can change. And it's for my own legacy. I hope this language that I've gotten in regulations and the laws stays there and that it gets better implemented, and that the kids in school now and later don't face, and the families don't face so many barriers and so much fights, and can be just parents.
I think that's so powerful because we have had a previous podcast guest that also has a son that lives on his own with Down syndrome. And prior to having her on the podcast, I remember when Summer brought that topic to my attention, it immediately sparked my interest. I said, a person with Down syndrome living on their own. I said, that is a story in itself because it's so unheard of that they have the ability to live on their own and have a what society would say as a functional life. And I think not only is Steve a success story on the disability side, he's a success story on the able-bodied side too, because he's living his best life no matter what, because you have given him the tools and he's expanded on that and he's just living how he wants to live.
Yeah. And I want to point out, it's not that he doesn't have support.
Right,
He does have support. He has
right,
home and community-based services that we worry about through Medicaid, who support him and help him in his independent living. But he is far more independent than I ever imagined when he moved out. I didn't know how well he would do this,
right.
but he's doing very well. And I like to say, some people will say, oh, well, it's because you're his mother and all that you've done. But, I wasn't with him all day at school. I'm not with him at work. I'm not with him
Right.
in his apartment. He has had to take it from there. So he gets a lot of the credit, but he's not alone. A lot of his friends, and some are more able, some are less able in a lot of ways, with supports from home and community-based waivers, can live in the community. And so, that's why it's not the work I'm primarily involved in. Heather Sachs is more involved in that. But NDSC, we're really working hard on making sure these home and community-based services stay there, because that's the ultimate goal, right? I mean,
Yeah.
education is to get out, get a job, get a place to live, be in the community, access community activities. I mean, it's not just an end in and of itself. It's an end towards a successful future to the maximum extent
You
possible
know,
of your choosing.
I think that's so powerful because they don't know. Like you said, when Steve was in the first grade, just give him a chance. If living on his own didn't work, then we you guys would have figured out something. But you guys gave him the chance to live independently and have a chance to live like everybody else. And because you gave him that chance in first grade, he is now living on his own and being able to have choice in the community and being able to be in theater and being able to work and make his own money. That's what everybody in society wants to do. They want to contribute. And because you gave him a chance in first grade, it's all a domino effect. If you wouldn't have given him a chance in first grade, we wouldn't be where you're at now.
And to go back to the teacher thing, I would say to them that they have a lot of kids in their class who might be just as successful without them personally as a teacher. And a lot of teachers do go into the profession to help students. And so I say to them, but this student and a number of your other students who may not have as much privilege or show the ability level, this student and those students are who you personally can make a difference in their life. And I would tell them that Steve learns like an iceberg. It's under the surface for years, and then all of a sudden it'll peek through, like he did that with swimming. Never thought he'd swim right up until the day, after years of swim lessons, until the day he swam across the pool. So I said, so some teacher in third or fourth grade is going to think she or he is a genius, because all of a sudden this is going to come out. But it's been you, even though you haven't really seen much progress, still trying, still working, still giving him opportunities that are building these skills that will come out later. And so when he left elementary school, I gave each teacher a rose, because I said, it's not just this teacher that's now standing up here with him in fifth grade graduation. It's all of you, who built this, and helped him, support him to build himself to this level. So, sometimes they need to see where it's going, when the day to day they may be frustrated because they're not really seeing the progress they may say in a typical child whose progress trajectory, might be quicker. So I think that's, that is important.
You saying that gives me a little bit of hope, because I've I've put my daughter in swim lessons. She loves the water, but she hates swimming lessons. That's kind of a sign to me to try swimming lessons again. Just so you know, like we struggled with swimming lessons. on a
Yeah,
person.
that's a very important life skill to have, to
It
be able to
is, it
swim for
is, and
sure.
she loves the water, but she just did not like swimming lessons.
Your point, Bryce, about, successes for even a typical adult. I know a lot of friends' kids who don't have any disabilities who are living at home. So Steve is like leading the pack on some of them.
Right.
Yeah. What message do you want every family that's listening to this podcast to walk away with?
I think the most important thing is the message I had at the beginning about how you're already an advocate. And so don't be, terrified or put off of that. In it, you could take it as far as you want to take it, but you can make a difference in both your child's life and in the life of others. Even just, I wanted to point out one thing that gives me some hope about inclusion is that even just in the typical, if your child is included, or even if they're not, but there are other typical peers that they're playing on the playground or in lunch, these students, if you can facilitate friendships, that is great for both
Yes.
students to have those
Yeah.
friendships when they're young. But these are the people who are going to grow up to be the teachers. And already, I mean, kids in my, who went to school with my son are already of age to be teachers. They will bring a different attitude, I hope, and different expectations because none of Steve's teachers had ever been educated with a child with Down syndrome. They never expected when they went to school that they would ever be educating a student with Down syndrome. But kids who grew up with my kid, who went to school with him, who saw his abilities, them being the next teachers, administrators, I think that is what ultimately, because we have the law, we need to turn it around with attitudes a lot. And so my son is a general educator. My daughter-in-law is a special educator, and their experiences with someone with Down syndrome helps them look at education differently. And whether it's in a special ed class or whether it's in a general education class like Steve went through his whole career, they are taking different expectations for the students with them and different ideas about what's possible and different ideas about how do you include an individual in a classroom which has very diverse abilities within that classroom. And so even within their friendships, when you go to an activity, bowling, or whatever you might do with your kid and other kids, you're modeling ways that you can adapt if you need to adapt certain things for this child versus this child who may not need as much support, or this one who might need, is so great that they need more challenge, and how you do that within a family, within a play date, within whatever it may be.
Yeah, that's Bryce and I went through Partners in Policy Making, and one of our fellow PIP grads was a young man with profound autism, and his mom was there as a support. And she said that 20 of his fellow classmates went into either special education or a field within the disability community. And all because of their,
Right.
eh, yeah, their
So that's
experience
the
with
hope.
Jeremy.
That's the hope for the future. And if you're so inclined to learn more about advocacy, like someone said, if you're going to the convention this summer, there is an advocacy boot camp. We also have NDAC, and I will be sending somewhere a link to that application. Like I said, it's free. It doesn't, you can just lurk, on the Facebook group. You could just, see where your level is. And where your level is now may not be, you might want to get more involved later on when your child's a little older. Everybody has to take it in their own way. And, but whatever setting your child's educated in, you know, we don't question whether someone makes a choice for regular ed, special ed. We do focus a lot of our advocacy on inclusion because that is the decision, if a family makes it, that is much harder to achieve and achieve well than it is if you choose to have your child in a separate classroom. But we respect and honor, all choices and all people. And so, it would be great for you to sign up and just be on there to whatever extent you be on. And you can meet, there are other people from your states. You might have opportunities to meet other people who are interested in advocacy in your states. And we have some groups that form statewide advocacy groups. So people interested in different Down syndrome groups in the state join together and form a statewide group and advocate at the state level. If that's your thing, if that's not your thing, then it's not your thing. But
Yeah.
it's good to look into and see where you think, your level and your interests and where you are in your life will take you right, now.
Yes. Yes. I 10 out of 10 highly recommend
Yes, I agree with
um
that.
connecting with the National Down Syndrome Congress, and if you can attend the convention, it's absolutely amazing experience and a great way to connect to those
Which this
resources.
summer is in Orlando, so that's fun.
Yes. Yes. Well, is there any last thoughts that you want to share before we sign off?
Not really, unless you have any more questions. I want to thank you both, obviously, for inviting me and for doing this podcast and getting this information out to families. There's only so many people we can reach from the national level. So to have people at the state level and the local level amplifying these messages and helping families feel comfortable with their journeys is incredibly important. I was on the board of my local Down syndrome group. I think the local work is so important.
Yes.
We appreciate the compliment very much.
Yes, and we appreciate you taking the time to visit with us today. We learned a few things, and I know our listeners are going to enjoy this as well. So with that, I'm going to let Bryce sign us off.
Well, this is for this is the end of Where the Ramp Ends. I'm Bryce.
And I'm Summer.
Yeah. And this is Where the Ramp Ends and Where Your Journey Begins. Till next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.